I am Casey Lazan. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Planning and Programs at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We are the regional transportation planning agency, and we're also a council of 28 city and county governments in the Sacramento region. So we are responsible for transportation planning and funding. We are also a convening body for all of those 28 cities and counties in the region for them to get together to address challenges, regional challenges. So challenges that every local city and county may face that have regional implications. So that is what we are. And I want you to, my panelists, to pay attention to the description I gave, because I'm actually going to be asking each of you to introduce yourselves and the role that your agency plays so that our audience has an understanding of the perspectives that you will be bringing to this discussion. But before that, Perspectives panel, what we are talking about today, and the question that this group is going to be answering for us, is how can government, industry, and academia work together to promote the next generation of sustainable communities? So I want to give you a sense of what are some questions that they were asked to think about as they were preparing for this today. What policies, design strategies, technologies appear most useful to help bring about sustainable communities in the future? What strategies and technologies haven't worked or haven't yet been tried? What institutional, economic, or regulatory changes appear necessary to help these innovations come about? What strategies are most promising in order to address social dimensions of sustainable communities? How might specific policy frameworks, such as the State of California's climate planning framework, incorporate such strategies? How might market change be leveraged to support sustainable communities? And how might academia, the public sector, private industry, and civil society better coordinate their efforts to bring about sustainable communities? So we are asking of our panelists to speak to us for about 9 minutes each. I know, you got, sorry guys. I was trying to help you out. 5 minutes each, and then we're gonna have a discussion with them. So we're gonna start off with Jose. Please introduce yourself, Jose.
Thank you, Casey. Great to be here. My name is Jose Bodipo Memba. I'm the Director of Sustainable Communities for SMUD. SMUD, for most folks, is Sacramento's municipal electric utility. And again, so we are as a quasi-governmental organization. So this conversation about what role does government, academia, industry, how do they essentially collaborate to address the next generation of sustainable communities definitely hits close to home. We'll talk a little bit about this map before, because it actually is an example of such collaboration that we're moving on with SMUD. But really, I just kind of want to take a quick step back in terms of how we're describing sustainable communities. Again, that question was asked during the first panel conversation. And for SMUD, we're really looking at, we call them our 4 pillars of sustainable communities, looking at how we address social well-being, a healthy environment, prosperous economy, and mobility, and looking at all that holistic approach to sustainable communities. And really, from our perspective, what role we have is leveraging our influence from our technical expertise and our relational expertise, and really trying to convert our role not just to a funder and implementer, but also a convener, because I think it's a role that we play well, being able to bring some of these parties together and allowing folks to align their strengths in what they do to deliver a better collective impact overall. So one of the things that we've talked about at SMUD as it relates to that conversation is we have access to a customer base that has a strong trust of our organization. And so we have the ability to start communicating and educating the sustainable communities concepts to a number of different community groups. I have the pleasure of being up here with Emmanuel, who I got a chance to work with for 9 years, and her team did a great job of creating real strong relationships within the community, to where we can leverage that to have real conversation on the grassroots level to really make this a comprehensive process. But one of the things that we've really talked about overall with SMUD in our role is how do we reach out and develop closer partnerships that aren't just so transactional, but really are built on these long-term collective goals of sustainability, and that address the issues of equity that we've talked about, the issues of different population types and what have you. And so we've really been strategic in looking at partnerships with some key organizations that we've developed trust, but also address some of the key areas of impact, or neighborhoods of higher impact in our disadvantaged communities and underserved communities, and really try to establish relationships and partnerships at an implementation level, at a convening level, and an alignment level. And so from our perspective, what we can do really goes back to what we all learned in kindergarten. We can collaborate better. We can play better in the sandbox with each other. I think one of the biggest hurdles that we have to get over as a region is that everyone is doing the work, and the Brookings Institute study talked about this before. There's tons of organizations doing great work, but we don't necessarily work together. There was a discussion at our table before, who is the big voice that's supposed to make that priority decision? Well, what SMUD's trying to do is help in that conversation, put our foot out there with the information and data that we have to help align that prioritization conversation, but also use that convening relationship to get folks in the same room. Because from our perspective, we can't do it by ourselves. And so the map that you see behind us is actually a culmination and something that will be released this quarter. And it's a sustainable community sensitivity map that actually we work with UC Davis and a number of other partners in putting together. Again, how do we concentrate our efforts and identify where most of the work needs to be done? Because again, that equity conversation really comes up. The environmental justice history within the state of California has had a disproportionate impact on our underserved communities. And so I think what we can do is really understand what we do well, and what SMUD does well is we have lots of data and information that we can share, and that's why we're making this an open source tool that other jurisdictions can use and leverage for their specific needs. So for example, we had a conversation with the city of Sacramento, and in the city of Sacramento, they have some specific desires that don't necessarily address what SMUD needs, but this base map can help guide them in terms of where some of the issues might be. And again, this is just one step. The other thing that I think that jurisdictions, whether they be cities, universities, or public agencies like SMUD can do is take bold steps and create priorities and metrics. So one thing we'll be doing in the next month and a half is identifying what our SMUD's, essentially our goalposts, our metrics of how we're gonna evaluate our impact in the community. It's great for us to be able to roll out programs, but how do we ensure that they actually meet the outcomes that we've desired? Again, that can be a very politically risky conversation because what happens when we invest in SMUD, for example, in our integrated resources plan, we're investing about $7 billion over the next 20 years with a high proportionate level of that infrastructure being in underserved communities to ensure that electric vehicle distribution that was discussed in the last conversation isn't that big divide that increases our disparity gap, but actually is done equitably. But how we make sure that the outcomes actually meet what our intended goals are and that we don't have unintended impacts. So we're gonna be reporting on that. So it's really important, I think, again, going back to the beginning, and I'm looking forward to a conversation because I know we work closely with Bob and his team on Aggie Square and how we make sure this is an integrated conversation as opposed to separate jurisdictions working in silos. So I think we're starting, but it really goes back to that childhood lesson, play well with others. Not to worry about who gets the credit. And again, I think this is just an example of a tool that can be used and developed collaboratively if we take the egos out and really focus on the end outcome.
All right, thank you, Jose. All right, next we are going to be moving to Andrew Hargidan. Did I get that right?
Shoot, I was hoping to follow a bit on Bob's. So, I'm not organized yet. All right. I am delighted to be here, although I'm never quite sure why I'm here. So I will give it my best shot, and hope that out of it comes some interesting conversations, whether now or later. I study innovation. I'm at the Graduate School of Management. Before I was a professor, I worked in the Silicon Valley for various companies doing that, but decided it was much more enjoyable to study that. Certainly much better nights and weekends. But I'm probably here because a lot of what I study would qualify as sustainable innovation. In other words, what innovations changed society for the better. And also because I was involved in the founding of the Energy Efficiency Center here on campus. Dan Sperling and I don't know if Dan's, and a number of others were there. I think we were some of the remaining ones. But also in that role, it was central to sort of convening the redesign, the big rethink of the West Village project, moving it from a zero net energy home community to a zero net energy community. And that had significant ramifications, obviously, as Bob knows, because to your point, Jose, Bob was the guy who was setting the goals and clarifying what was important. And so we were able to work towards that. But it involved bringing a lot of people together, from developers and engineers and consultants and campus folks, to figure out what was the best possible solution and not in the best of each of their individual interests. And so I would say briefly, to give some sense of where my interests overlap with sustainable communities, is that my research really focuses on the emergence of innovations, which the more time I've spent, the more convinced I am that all innovations are systems. So with a nod to this morning, I think it's really important to recognize that when we're talking about any innovations, we're talking about the building of systems. And what I ended up realizing I'm looking at is sort of the ontogeny of systems. Where do they come from? What's the life cycle of a system? Because it doesn't start out fully baked and fully integrated. And so how and where do successful systems emerge became a large part of my research agenda. And I'm going to speak briefly about one phenomenon that I think, I hope resonates, at least aspirationally, when it comes to thinking about how government, industry, and academia can work together. And it's something called creative spirals. And so creative spirals are a really interesting phenomenon that I don't think many people are aware of. Probably they don't spend as much time in the archives. But in the early days of new innovations, new systems, there's usually this really short period that's an enormous burst of creativity. And it's not invention, but it counts as such if you're a lawyer. So for example, I'll give you Edison. He didn't invent the light bulb, he invented a system of electric lighting. And in his first 2 years of working on the project, he and his lab developed 14 patents. In the next 2 years, they generated, as they decided to start to build out the system of lighting, and they built the Pearl Street Station in New York. In that process, they generated 300 patents. So the idea for the electric light and the lighting system that led him to start a company and get investors took 14 patents. The process, the early days of building out that system generated 300 more patents. So if you use patents as a measure of creativity, most of the creativity happened after they had the vision and the general idea. And if you look at other situations like that, penicillin was another good example. It was the first antibiotic created, and it really created the template for modern pharmaceutical firms and the industry entirely. It took them 2 years to go from recognizing the action of a mold in its ability to kill bacteria to having discovered the active ingredient and a way to produce it at scale. But the way they had to figure out how to produce it was inefficient and uneconomical. But they got the US government to back their idea, and over the next 2 years, it became 450 times more productive to produce, more economical to produce, and the capacity grew 18 million-fold. I kid you not, I had to do the math about 3 times to make sure I understood. But it went from a worldwide capacity of 40,000 units to over 725 billion units a month, which was enough to satisfy world demand of something that 2 years earlier they didn't think they were going to be able to produce enough to be anything other than a science project. So you see this time and again. You see this in mass production, particularly with the Ford Motor Company in about a 5-year period. You see this in the early internet of advertising and publishing, but also the infrastructure. Literally in 2 to 4 years, complete exponential revolutions in the performance of systems. And so my question has been in that research, how do you create these moments of, these creative spirals? What are the conditions that make them possible? And a lot of that obviously comes back in our shared values and how do you apply that to the kinds of problems we're trying to deal with today? So in the design of sustainable communities, how much time, frankly, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I am not aware of a lot of research that goes into looking at how we design sustainable communities. We look at how we should design them, but not necessarily the process by which we follow to make that most effective. And so I'll throw out some of the findings of this work on creative spirals to trigger hopefully conversations later. One of the things, following Jose, I'm really glad he mentioned it, was the presence of a clear architect and a clear vision. It was somebody, some organization, but particularly some person who had vested in them the power to convene and direct this effort, but also a very clear goal. And in fact, an architecture that was usually wrong, but at least initially gave them a script and a schema to follow to build it out. There was a small committed group. I say that simply because while there's a lot of focus on engagement and other pieces that have to do as much with buy-in, community buy-in, the small committed group was there because the interactions between them is where most of the ideas came from in these creative spirals. Nobody actually could be credited with an individual idea in this particular situation. A third aspect, which I think bears attention, is these creative spirals happened in a moment of confusion, and that's a very academic term. But confusion in this case doesn't mean an absence of knowing what to do. It means actually an abundance of knowing what to do. In other words, we know how to do this 3 or 4 different ways, and we're not sure what's the right way. So rather than being confused by not knowing anything, it's by knowing too much and knowing too many ways and trying to figure out which of those ways works best. One of the fascinating things about these spirals is the testimony of the people involved was never, I didn't know what to do. It was more like, well, this was what we could do. I just didn't know if it would work. And so they literally, I could go down the list. The stories are wonderful. But it's shocking because, of course, we tend to associate creativity with coming up with something new when, in fact, it was more about figuring out which old thing to bring to the party. The fourth element was a highly iterative process. And this is where I think we're most challenged because most of the time what was so effective was their ability to rapidly iterate, to prototype, test, and refine, and get quick feedback, not of an individual element in the system, but of how that element fit into the system. Whether it integrated with and created virtuous cycles or fell apart through creating vicious cycles in the system itself. And I think that's challenging when we talk about community designs that may take 10 years or more to plan and build. And then the last piece was the aspect of robust design, which was that the goal of the process was to build a solution that mapped and matched onto the vision, but also make it adaptable to the future, which is essentially sort of a generative approach to design. Following the notion, at least the findings here, because most of the benefits and most of the ideas happen after you've had the original idea and as you're building out the system, that process is a generative one. It produces more opportunities to solve problems than we would ordinarily think. It's not about closing it down. And that generativity is really critical to the system's success, both in the short run and then in the long run as it evolves. And so to the extent that we're thinking about these groups, are we thinking about the opportunities they're creating for the next generation of people participating in these systems to then build again more on the solutions? So that's my work, and I hope it maps on. I can tell you very sincerely with experience that working with Bob and UC Davis on the energy efficiency and its work, I think we saw moments like that. SMUD has been a terrific partner in exactly that, in building out the work of the Energy Efficiency Center over the last decade. And I look forward to more of that. So I'm glad to hear your words about all the opportunities. And that's pretty much my story.
Thank you, Andrew. As everyone will see, we have very diverse perspectives and expertise here. So we are going to move on first, thirdly, to Robert Seeger to talk about introduce yourself and then address our question. And so we're going to try to get through everyone and then jump into what I hope will be a very interesting conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Casey. And thanks, Andy. I'm actually glad I got to go after you instead of the other way around. And to Jose as well for SMUD's leadership all across the Sacramento region. Andy, you prompted a lot of thoughts about framework and systems, and that I'd love to reflect on being in the middle of the exercise I'm in the middle of right now, but first I'll tell people about what that is. So I've been the campus planner at UC Davis for 31 years. So if you're familiar with this campus and you've seen some changes over the years, I've had a hand in most of that, but many, many hands, of course, in addition to mine. And just for the last couple years, and I think it's why I'm here, and Andy and I did have a chance to work together on West Village and its ambitious zero net energy community goals, and there were moments like that for sure. And I want to reflect on, I use the word framework a lot as something that I need to move forward, as something with enough clarity to take the next step, but enough flexibility to be able to take other ideas in and reshape. And I think over the years I've kind of got a definition for myself of what that means. But what I'm involved in now for the last just over a year and a half is this very ambitious UC Davis project in Sacramento at the Sacramento campus of UC Davis. For those of you who don't know, Davis campus here is about 5,000 acres and right adjacent, as you know, to the city of Davis. And the campus in Sacramento is anchored by the medical center and the School of Medicine, School of Nursing. It's about 150 acres. It's in the Oak Park, Tahoe Park, Elmhurst part of Sacramento, a couple miles from the capital. And a couple years ago, our Chancellor May, who's been here just over 2 years in last August, really decided that there was an opportunity at the Sacramento campus of UC Davis to create, for lack of a better term, let's call it an innovation district. And what we mean by that is it's a different model for a campus. It's a co-location campus, okay? So it's an opportunity for university activity to sit side by side with business and industry enterprise, with community-based organizations, with other educational partners. It's a partnership co-location campus. The activities that get attracted there are activities that will benefit from that co-location. It's also emerged as a huge opportunity for linkages, increasing linkages on the academic side across our two campuses from Davis to Sacramento. So it sits on that Sacramento campus. I've come to reframe it from, the way we used to talk about it is that Davis is the main campus and the medical center's in Sacramento. And the way I frame it now is Davis is the college town campus and Sacramento is the urban campus. Can you see how that flipped it, right? As soon as you do that, all kinds of opportunities come up at the urban campus that are different and distinct and full of opportunity, not just that the medical center's there, but it's in the state capital, it's in neighborhoods that have really deep need and opportunity and different assets than we have here. So, so this innovation district called Aggie Square the planning area is about 25 acres on that 150-acre campus. Phase 1 is on about 8 acres and is planned for about 1 million square feet, so it's very dense, unlike this environment. And it's very diverse in its goals and in its vision. So that 1 million square feet, about half of that is envisioned to be life sciences, technology, engineering type functions, but again, not just university, and I'll give you an example, and it gets to Andy's innovation as systems. I'll give you an example in that life sciences, technology, engineering theme, but about half of it is that. We have a office and classroom project that we call, that's a lifelong learning theme. At the university, lifelong learning is now a new name for university extension, which tends to mean post-professional, but we actually mean lifelong learning, starting at youth development and career development and corporate and nonprofit partners in training and education all the way up to post-professional. So people are used to thinking about ecosystems in tech and who you sit next to whom. By the way, sometimes when I describe what campus planning is, the one-liner is, well, I just help figure out what goes next to what. Because what goes next to what is actually who goes next to whom, and who goes next to whom is kind of a powerful thing. So if you sat next to somebody today, you had the chance at a conversation. If you didn't, you didn't. So the opportunity to orchestrate what goes next to what and who goes next to whom is actually a systems very powerful thing. But I digress. So Life sciences, technology, engineering, big theme. Lifelong learning is a big theme. Food and health is a big theme, and I see Gail, and I know she's going to speak to school gardens and is an expert. One of the dangers of my role at the university is I'm just the university planner guy, and there's always someone who's an expert who knows way more than I do about any one topic, but I'm going to go there anyway because got to. So food and health is another theme, et cetera, et cetera. We have 4 goals for Aggie Square. One of them is all about the university, advancing innovation and entrepreneurship and at the university across the entire enterprise, teaching and research and engagement with our communities. Another one is to propel economic development in the city of Sacramento. And that is a direct result of our chancellor's partnership with the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg. All of our planning committees are co-commissioned by the mayor and the chancellor. That's a different thing. Okay, that isn't the way it's typically done. The third one is to contribute to local community resiliency, and that brings on all of the social impact side and trying to do what we can do to be contributors as SMUD, again, as leaders in many of those efforts. And the fourth one is more of a how-to to create great public places and sustainable environments. But really, it's sustainability on a much bigger scale about partnership than strictly the environmental side of things. So with those 4 goals, themes have emerged. I mentioned those. A couple of examples on the system side that I think where we're trying, I mean, those 4 goals, everybody gets goals, right? But we actually have those on the wall. So if something makes sense at Aggie Square, it's because it does advance the university programs and innovation. It does propel economic development, more diversity of the economy in Sacramento and new jobs. It does stand a good chance of contributing to local impact in a positive way for members of our community, and it does help create places that bring people together and promote sustainability. And I can't overstate the power of the place-based part of it. The fact that we're creating a place that has the opportunity to bring people together around these themes is critical to people taking it seriously and propelling and stepping up and thinking there's actually a way to partner. 2 examples. And I am not an expert in either one, but I know just enough to describe some of the connectivity. So the first one is in that life sciences area. One of the areas that there's a great deal of expertise and experts and also assets at the Sacramento campus is in the area of regenerative medicine. And that evolves from the whole stem cell studies and cell and gene therapies that are emerging, brand new therapies that are emerging, and UC Davis is as well positioned to do that work as anyone. What I've learned about that endeavor is that it takes the research at the front end, it takes innovation in the engineering of equipment and systems to bring the cost of those therapies down because they're incredibly expensive at the custom way that they're done. And then it takes a hospital and healthcare system to pilot and do the clinical trials and test these therapies. So we thought, after we did our scan and looked at places around the world that were investing in these new therapies, we thought we actually have an opportunity to co-locate that entire system at the UC Davis campus in Sacramento, from the research at the front end to co-locating with business and industry partners who are pioneering the engineering that it takes to deliver these therapies effectively and bring the cost down to a healthcare system where they could be piloted, tested, and eventually these life-saving, and these are therapies for diseases for which there are no cures at this point in time. So they are radically, potentially life-saving innovations. And so we're pursuing that. And by looking at it as a system like that and being able to describe our opportunity to host different sectors of the economy that contribute to innovation along the way, we have an immensely positive opportunity to actually make good on that. That's one example. The other one I'm going to go to is food and health. For those of you who are in the area, you may have read an announcement last week that at Aggie Square we're partnering with an institute formed by Alice Waters that grows out of our Edible Schoolyard Foundation, and Gail Feenster's speaking next, I know, and knows way more about this topic and kids and gardens and schools and food health than I ever will. But I want to talk about that partnership and the power of it and the way it cuts across, again, those goals and these communities of interest. So the Edible Schoolyard Foundation, their goal is through gardens and through food-based programs at schools to involve kids in both the growing and the cooking and the partaking and the educational value of food and the healthy outcomes from eating healthy food from that entire system. It's a systems approach. In the scaling up to Aggie Square that we're going to be working with Alice Waters on, she took it's one of the most clearly stated and both complex visions I've ever heard. It has 4 words: free, sustainable school lunch. Okay? That's an immensely complex vision, but it's really clear in those 4 words. Each of those 4 words, by the way, in the affiliation with the university, is like a vertical of research, policy, and practice. A whole bunch of research, policy, and practice work around free, around sustainable, around school and integrating with curriculum and kids learning, and lunch, delivering a healthy plate of food to a kid every day and what a difference it makes to them, okay? So we're partnering. But let me talk about one more dimension and then I'll stop. I know I went too long. One more dimension is, so we're talking, in this role that we're playing now at the urban campus in more urban Sacramento, there's this whole emerging conversation around anchor institutions. Those are how to describe that? We took a visit to Cleveland, which is really the home of one of the most advanced and productive anchor coalitions in the country. And what it is, a city like Cleveland, where big industry picked up and left, they looked around, they said, who's not leaving? Okay, and for economic and local development, who's not leaving are the eds and meds. The educational institutions, the medical institutions, the cultural institutions that are embedded in those communities that became the biggest employers. So the anchor institution part, in addition to our mission-related work in education and research, the anchor institution part, we're also huge employers and huge buyers of goods. Edible Schoolyard is about school districts being big buyers of food for their kids. Same thing at the UC Davis health system. Our chef, Santana Diaz, introduced himself to Alice Waters. He said, I run the second biggest production kitchen in the city of Sacramento. The first biggest production kitchen in the city of Sacramento is the Sacramento Joint Unified School District. When those 2 entities start partnering and say, we want to locally source organic food, they can change the market. Okay? That's the anchor institution showing up, in addition to the mission part about education and research. I'll stop there. I could go on, obviously. But that's the creative spiral I'm in the middle of, and it's very exciting. There's a framework for it, but it's very open. It's defined by partnership.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Okay, we have our last speaker, Erica Emmanuel. Go ahead and introduce yourself and give us your answers to this question.
Great, well, thank you. This is a really fun panel, so thanks for having me. My name is Erica Emmanuel. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Local Government. ILG is a statewide nonprofit organization. We're the national affiliate of the League of California Cities, the Special Districts Association, and the State Association of Counties. So together with those affiliates, we represent over 2,000 local agencies in the state, between 2,000 and 5,000, depending on what you count, right? So that's kind of the lens with which I'm coming to this panel with. We are literally focused on local government and helping them, specifically local agency leaders, whether that's their staff or whether that's elected officials. We want them to operate effectively and implement policies on the ground. So that's the perspective that I'm going to bring. And what we do at ILG, there's 4 main things. The first one is leadership and governance. We help leaders understand the frameworks of government and the pillars of democracy so they really understand their role and how it differs from other layers of government. And we do that at the state level, and we do that at the city level, and we do that at the county level, and we do that within agencies as well. So jurisdictions know the distinction between elected officials and staff. We also do public engagement. And I don't mean the rudimentary style, you have 72-hour public notice style public engagement. We try to teach deep, meaningful, really messy public engagement that moves the needle on projects that help build trust in communities. We teach it, and then we help municipalities really embed it in their culture. We also do sustainability, which is maybe why we're here, but we help local governments tackle sustainability in a way that works for them. And that's really important at the level that I work because we help walk them through it hand in hand, and we change the narrative about it so that it resonates with the people who live in the communities that they're serving. And the last thing we do is workforce development and civics education. Because if you as a private citizen don't understand how your government works, you cannot influence that government, and you certainly aren't likely to vote in an election, run for an office, or work for the government. So we teach students and sometimes adults how the government works, and we do that for the future of our democracy, but we also do that for the future of the public sector workforce. And that could be the workforce that is literally planning out the next generation of sustainable communities. So that's the body of work that's going to play a role in the perspectives that I'll bring to this panel. But the other part of this, of course, and When I took this job, I said I would always bring my authentic self, so I'm going to bring the community organizer in me, I'm going to bring the former PR executive in me, I'm going to bring the Central Valley native in me, I'm going to bring the woman of color to this panel. And I bring that up because I think that is what has been useful and not useful when we think about what local agencies see every day and what they take back with them when it comes time to implement policies on the ground. I have a lot of priorities individually, personally, professionally, and so do all of the local leaders that I work with. And when we start talking about sustainability on the ground at the local level, to the people that are responsible for implementing this work, we have to understand and recognize that every single one of them has a slightly different perspective and a different priority and a different lens with which to view this issue. And it's not a single issue, it's a really complicated one. And understanding that lens, I think, will help all of the state policies and local ones really be more effective. So one thing I've seen is that painting a broad brush across California with a top-down, cookie-cutter sustainability policy that doesn't reflect the unique natures of our regions or of our communities, that's a mistake. We've heard that today. One of the perks of being the last panel, or one of the last panels of the day, is you've heard a lot of really incredible statistics. I will not repeat those, but I'll try and give you a flavor of what I see and experience day in and day out so that when we come out of this session at the end of the day, we'll have something meaningful we can take back, because we rely on academic institutions and others to really bring ideas forward. But I want you to be able to make sure those ideas are successful, and I see what happens on the ground. Sweeping policies that are generic tend to breed resentment at the local level, and they usually aren't effective, and at best they are focusing on the low-hanging fruit and the early adopters, right? You're talking about the communities that are already heading in that direction, already interested in doing this, and typically those are large urban, metropolitan, and suburban towns with a high tax base. So when I think about the ones that we need to bring on, the ones that we need to recruit for this next generation, we need to be focusing on the traditionally diverse and the highest need. And we know this from data, right? US EPA, Department of Ag, they tell you that the impacts of climate change are felt hardest across rural America. So it's the small towns and the small communities that we need to be addressing. So we need to think about in 5, 10, or 20 years, how are we gonna get everyone else on board? It's not about the people, no offense to Sacramento, I love Sacramento, I used to work at SMUD, no offense to the places that are already on the bandwagon, but how do we move the needle elsewhere? So where I graduated from high school was a tiny town in Stanislaus County. Population at the time was 2,000. When I lived there, there was one stoplight. There were lots of mom and pop shops. There were people that were mostly middle to low income, and 50%, approximately 47, let's say, Spanish speakers native. The community was steeped in agriculture, it was steeped in religion, it was steeped in football. Okay, that's my town. And I loved it. But what I didn't know at the time and what I didn't see was that that same town was struggling not only with economic development, but with environmental issues ranging from educational attainment to job creation to housing access to air quality and transportation, because we were all commuting back and forth to the Bay Area, right? So that's the lens with which I think about the next generation of sustainable communities. Think about the small, the under-resourced, and the culturally diverse communities, the tiny ones, because that's who I see every day. That's who my organization works with deeply every single day. A little bit more perspective about local agencies, cities, counties, special districts, city managers, planners, in some of those smaller cities. So there are 482 cities in California, 300 have populations of 50,000 or fewer. So the vast majority are gonna be very small, right? So if you wanna bring people along, at least in this state, think about the majority of the communities. And then they come up and you lift it up and you're in a regional level. So these local agencies are delivering hundreds of critical services to their community every week or month. And this is often the case. Sustainability is not the immediate concern. It is not the urgent issue of the day. There is a much bigger issue of the day. And they are fighting a literal and figurative fire right in front of them. And they don't necessarily have the capacity to simultaneously address the crisis that's coming down the road. They also have a really big challenge with recruitment and retention of qualified staff. It's a major issue in smaller, disadvantaged, and rural communities. So one of the things my organization does is we provide technical assistance and capacity building to communities across the state. We funded a program called the Beacon Program, which is, it helps cities and counties really engage on sustainability initiatives. We have 152 cities and counties in our program, and part of that comes with really hands-on support for grants and other programs. You would be amazed at how many times my staff gets assigned a great team member to work on a project, to work on something, and then within 2 to 3 years, that person has now been recruited away And all of that institutional knowledge is gone in that community. There's a critical knowledge gap, and that's happening across the state. The turnover of qualified staff in cities and towns is significant, and it impacts their ability to apply for grants, let alone be able to implement them if they get them, because these are highly technical, sometimes sustainability projects. So when we say that money is out there for local agencies, that's very true, but oftentimes they can't access it, and there are a lot of reasons why that's the case. I'll give you another example. The city of Lemoore, which is in Kings County, they were really lucky, and they were able to apply for an ARA grant to replace their LED lights, their street lights. They got a $100,000 grant, and they're going to get this $6,000 annually on their energy bill, right? That's actually a lot of money for a local agency of a small town size, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other cities that could not apply, that did not apply, because they didn't have the match funds, because they didn't have the ability, right? So when you think about what funding is available, is the funding accessible? And it's really relevant to understand that landscape, because we have overworked, under-resourced local agency leaders that want to do really good work, and they want to prioritize this. But we've got to think about what the community is dealing with and how they're facing some of their immediate issues. And I know that you do think about that, but when we develop policies, they need to reflect the reality of what's being seen on the ground, and that we are not creating barriers to entries for those that we want to help the most. So the solution, right? This is all about solutions. Couple things. We've heard this, and I want to reiterate it. There needs to be collaboration between government, the private sector, I haven't heard this, the NGOs, and the education sector to achieve this goal. I think philanthropy plays a role. Individual cities, towns, and counties, no matter how committed they are, and I bless them, I work with them all the time, they probably won't be able to solve the climate crisis. They lack the capacity, they lack the capital, and right now they lack the control necessary to transform the systems that they have already in place. And I think you know this, but the political process at the local level in particular is not designed for speed or innovation, like my colleague at the end. It's designed for transparency and due process, right? That's not going to enable what we want to see. So there needs to be a collective effort to address energy and water and housing and land use and transportation and economic development, and it needs to be a collaborative effort. I know the governor's working really closely on the Regions Up Prosperity Strategy. That has some potential to address some of these regional impediments to climate action and economic development in general, but it's just one step. I also think we need to accomplish this by really thinking about sustainability and inclusivity. We started talking about it earlier today, but I do want to reiterate that even at the local level, equity really does matter. I think that we won't be successful in long term, and you've talked a little bit about this, but I want to bring it home. Climate, social justice, and racial equity cannot be separate and competing interests. I think that we have to address this challenge by thinking about the largest percentages of our population, particularly as that population continues to increase. And so bringing on additional policies is really helping move that needle. I am incredibly heartened by the increase of community-led and equity-advancing climate action programs, but we need more policies that support that. And then there's this exploration, I think, of the intersectionality of issues like broadband policy, water policy, transportation policy, housing policy, and education policy. If we look at them holistically, that's really important, because disparate policies and disparate mandates that all fall on local agencies will not be effectively implemented. We need to think about how can we work together to make sure that they all line up. Local agencies, unfortunately, have too much to do and not enough time and not enough money, despite what's available, and they don't have the human capital to get it done, not in the current form. So my organization's been working on a number of programs to help pilot some of these solutions to these issues, and what we've found to be effective, at least in our world, is to really start at the base level, understand the community and its values, understand the local leaders and the other challenges that they're facing, understand what they're already doing, because a lot of communities are doing some things, and how can you leverage that? And then we work together and we craft a solution with them that addresses their specific needs. And oftentimes, that solution involves technical assistance and on-the-ground capacity building. If we want to enact meaningful change in this area with local agencies at the table, we need to be willing to acknowledge that they actually need both technical assistance and capacity building support, and we need to create policies with funding to allow for that. We've had the privilege of working really closely with a lot of state agencies. SGC is one example, and there's many others. And we're doing a lot of this work to facilitate dialogue, bring stakeholders together, and identify some solutions that can build capacity in some of these small, rural, and disadvantaged communities. And before I wrap, I'll give you just one example of what that is, because I don't think we've heard this one yet. We were brought in a couple months ago to help the Air Resources Board in the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District with their implementation of AB 617, and that's the Community Engagement and Air Protection Program. It was designed to address air quality issues in disadvantaged communities, and you can look at the Enviro screen and see exactly where those communities are. The program really involves strong partnerships. It's with local and state agencies, it involves community stakeholders, and they're intended to build a regional plan that aligns with community values and priorities. We facilitated meetings, after they'd already begun, we were brought in to facilitate meetings in Fresno and Shafter, and this week we just started working on the new community, which was Stockton. And it's really exciting. I was there on Wednesday night, and it's like there's a whole different energy in Stockton. It is incredibly positive, it's incredibly palpable, it's hopeful. There were dozens of community members there for an air quality meeting to sign up for a new committee to stand in front of the world and say, this is what's important to us. And it was literally, state elected city council members, CARB officials, all of the forces of government and the community in the same room. And it reinforced what's working, and that is reframing the sustainability conversation so you're speaking the language to the people about issues that matter to them in the way that they think about them and addressing those issues that hit home. It was also really about making sure that they can work hand in hand together with elected leaders to shape their own priorities and solutions. And I think when you have a constant cycle of being elected, you want to make sure that elected leaders are on the table and at the table and able to connect and have support from their residents. So what I like about that program is the state provided the funding, the local agency provided the structure, and the community provided the voice. And my organization's a nonprofit, so we provided that neutral, nonpartisan support. And it was a really important example of a state-led sustainability program that is both equity conscious and community centered, and there's enough local funding to support proper implementation and the stakeholders feel engaged. SGC is doing phenomenal things as well. We heard from them already, and I think we can't reinforce enough that they're doing these things too. The work is there. It is not easy. In fact, it's hard to scale, but it's an important thing to pilot and test and acknowledge that there's a lot more help needed on the ground, but there's a lot of willingness, a ton of willingness at the local level by elected leaders, by city staff, by county staff, by local special district staff to do this work and to move the needle on climate change.
All right, thank you, Erica. So we've got wells of experience and information on different case studies of collaboration. We have a systems perspective on that as well between government and academia and industry. I think I could ask a question, but I think what I want to do right now is look to the audience and see if there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to offer up to this group to start this conversation. And if no one's jumping up, I'm going to jump in. Okay, all right. So I want to dig a little bit deeper because what we have been charged with in this conference is to kind of get into analysis and get into some specifics so that we can ultimately share these learnings with everyone. So I'm just going to ask across the table if you can get into some specifics of think of some successful collaboration between government and industry and academia or any of those combinations, whether it was your organization or one that you have worked with or studied. Can you talk about how did that come about?
I'll jump in real quick. We were talking at our table earlier. Right now, was mentioned before, another key component about establishing a truly sustainable community is ensuring that there is employment, ensuring that there's jobs. And Erica talked about the workforce development piece. So we actually have a collaboration that's happening right now that involves UC Davis, involves SMUD, involves private industry, and it's a training program through the Urban League. And again, all of these partners together. And we have 40 young professionals of all backgrounds in Del Paso Heights, which is a historically underserved community in the Sacramento region, who are doing a solar trainings program. We have We have businesses in place prepared to hire a high percentage of these individuals based off of their input in the curriculum. And so we have preparation by the end of the year to have 120 people that have gone through that program in an area where there's a need. And it's also bringing sustainable uses to neighborhoods where you don't necessarily see them. And how that collaboration took place was by us putting our egos at the door and reaching out and talking about what we could bring to the table. SMUD had some funding that we could bring to the table. SMUD had some educational expertise we could bring to the table. We were working with Baker Energy. They actually have instructors and they actually have the materials to do the hands-on training. They brought in Spotlight Solar. They have the structures to build in permanent beautification strategies. We brought in UC Davis. They have the tutoring support. So what happened was we looked at trying to solve a problem and work collaboratively. And now we're actually working with the city and we're working with the school district and we're bringing more partners to the table. And again, the key question is how do we make that replicable? I think the replication comes from really being intentional about looking at what's successful in the end, because again, there's gonna be some bumps in the road, but really looking at how can this benefit the overall community. The best part about the process is now we have folks coming to the table who want to partner. And I think that goes back to the intentional engagement, and it goes back to really something that everyone's talked about, the innovation mindset. I'll just lay one other successful process, even though it's not complete. The California Mobility Center is something that SMUD's leading, but is partnering with a number of the parties at the table. Again, it takes organizations to lead and to put their money on the ground. This is a program that's going to be starting in an underserved community. And speaking to what you mentioned before, it's not just about bringing autonomous mobility opportunities or EV mobility opportunities. It's all the ancillary innovation components that come after the fact. Now, this is a process, again, by, I think, organizations taking that leadership role and reaching out to partners in Sac State and UC Davis and the city of Sacramento have stepped to the table. I think part of it is trying not to do it all yourself and realizing that there's strength in numbers. And so, again, those are just a couple of examples. I'm sure the other individuals at the table would talk about that, but I would also say building an electrification policy that the city of Sacramento is leading in other areas and allowing folks like SMUD and others to help address that and working with folks like the Chamber of Commerce to identify some of the gaps and some of the concerns to come up with a better solution. These are ways in which agencies can work to address it from my perspective.
All right, thank you, Jose. I think
It is the the Career and Solar Energy Pathways Program.
excellent.
So the next session will be in April of this year.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions that are coming to mind, comments that folks have? Yes, over here. I think we need a microphone. And remember to state your name and stand up.
So at our table 4 this morning, when we were talking about how you get behavioral change to really ramp up everything, my question is a simple one. We have a really, really urgent problem. And we've started all these pilot projects, and we're starting to get good data back from these, and it's wonderful to hear the things that you all are doing here. My question is, how are we going to be able to really ramp up the success at scale that is going to be necessary if we're going to make the kinds of changes we need? When I hear all these things, they seem like really important, small pieces, but we almost need a war-type response. So I'm wondering if you've thought about what would it require to really get these things going?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll offer one sort of historic analogy, because how can I put this kindly? So a lot of my research, particularly penicillin, provides a really good example of this, because the transition point between 40,000 units a month of penicillin and 725 billion was the U.S. government. and particularly Alfred Richards, who was recently appointed to be head of the Council of Medical Research under Vannevar Bush, to essentially mobilize the U.S. for World War II. So this was a wartime mobilization. But I think, back to what Jose and Bob were saying, what he brought was, talk softly and carry a really big checkbook. He brought a checkbook, but he also brought the architecture. He said, this system that they have developed at Oxford is the system we will be scaling. And if you want to play, if you want to participate, we will give you the license to produce penicillin and we will sponsor your R&D. If you don't, you won't. And so he is, very, very quickly after that, the architecture changed, but it changed because he had brought enough people in with enough expertise to make it better. And I think that's the kind of mobilization that we need to have in mind. And the money was nice, but it was the architecture. Bob, you said it, I think, without a framework, everybody's hesitant to take the next step. With the framework, they can. And I think I just wanted to contrast that to the Department of Energy and the sort of the ARPA-E experience we had, which was come in and act like venture capitalists and make VC investments hoping that each of those individual companies will succeed rather than constructing a new field.
Can I just keep the conversation going? So
Yes.
when we asked this question of the EcoBlock project, what would make this happen at scale, I was really taken by, forgotten which one of you, maybe you mentioned the idea of who has the agency to really make a difference. And we're hoping that if the EcoBlock as a pilot project looks to be financially feasible and attractive, that there could be a whole third-party movement that rolls this out to communities, gets the participation, brings the expertise for making these microgrids. Or the utility recognizes that this is a way to rebuild its infrastructure. So, I'm wondering, when you think about these things, is the utility really asking the question, big power plants, millions of little meters, is that the right way to do things? We've got aging infrastructure. What's a good way to rebuild all of this? So, we're trying to get into a creative spiral here. It seems to me we have to be interested in what the agency is. Are they prepared to rethink things? Do they have the power to do that? Can they engage the communities in constructive ways? All of this. Because we're in a desperate situation, and we have to recognize the urgency.
I'm assuming, since you reference utilities, that you're talking to
That's
me.
for you, Jose.
I'll start, and I won't get into the specifics of your specific solution. What I can say is, again, SMUD has invested $7 billion as a part of our integrated resources plan, which is looking at how we get ahead and advance our goals as it relates to what you're just talking about. And specifically as it relates to the sustainability and equity conversation, what makes me proud to be representing SMUD here is that as a part of that process, we realize that if implemented incorrectly, it can really create and exacerbate the disparity gap that already exists within the Sacramento County region. So really leveraging the work that our team is doing, which is why some of the mapping work we do is important for our internal uses, is really important. And we're trying to target our infrastructure improvements in a balanced and equitable way to ensure that the entire region grows. And again, part of that is evaluating, getting that community buy-in, and taking a look at innovative solutions. But I think that innovative solution process comes from the interaction and leveraging everybody here at this panel and everyone here in this room and giving them agency to engage with SMUD. I can't speak for other utilities as to their approach, but I'm very confident in the way in which we've interacted and involved community members as a part of our overall process. It's something that we take tremendous pride in. But again, it's going to require bold steps. What I can say specifically, SMUD made investments in 1989 in wind technology and property when wind energy was not a viable state. That investment from '89 has paid off in tremendous ends now. The hydroelectricity investment that was made way back 60 years ago has resulted in reduced rates. So I'm very confident in our track record to do that, and I think we're positioned to do it well.
I want to actually answer that question as well on the behalf of the local agency piece. And I'm really happy that you asked, how do you scale this? Because, you can't go into 452 cities. It's not possible, right? You can't do that. But what you can do is like a program that we're working on with SGC, and I don't think Louise talked much about it, but it's a program that we launched last year called Boost, and we are working with 10 cities in 2 regions across California. And were specifically chosen because they represent, across the 12 of them, some of the key demographics of communities that we would want to see and that can be replicated across the state. And what we wanted to do was figure out how to help them make meaningful change on climate action. And so we are knee-deep with each of those, doing capacity building and deep technical assistance and helping them with whatever they've identified as a key value for them over the next year, and working with them very closely. And we're modeling all of these behaviors, and we're actually testing it, and we're documenting it so that we can see what things we can take, what can we replicate, how can we scale this across the state. And one thing I love about local agencies is they don't like reinventing the wheel. They love hearing best practices, they love case stories, they love understanding what was done and what was done well, and then building on that. And so creating the framework is an important step and a starting point, and we are moving the needle on that. And with the intention, and a lot of eyes are looking at this, of moving that forward in other cities and other regions, and making sure this is something that isn't just a one-stop.
I could just offer two, just in thinking of a couple experiences. One that Andy mentioned on our university project here at West Village, where I would say, where we aspired to zero net energy, and this was 15 years ago that we started working on that. And we got to maybe 90%. I would say we did it, no reason to be kind, despite our utility. But that was a big lift, and we didn't see an outbreak. And we did it with off-the-shelf stuff, basically. We didn't see an outbreak of zero net energy communities after that. And so I think part of your question, Harrison, is probably approaching each of these pilots with intention to scale in mind. And this one in Sacramento, where we're building 1 million square feet and we're working with SMUD, pretty different. It's got lab buildings, it's got office buildings, it's got residential, it's got dining. We're just seeing if we can electrify the whole thing, working with them. And if we can, at 1 million square feet scale, they'll have something. And they're interested in helping us try to get there. So different scale pilots probably matter too, but part of it is that partner who's embracing the scale problem from day one, I think.
So I'm sorry to add one more thing, but it's a teachable moment, so I think I'll throw it out. I think one of the important things to recognize in that process of scaling is that there's always the next level up to sell to. So, what Bob said, first you sort of have to prove that it works, and then you have to prove that it scales before the next level wants to adopt it. And proving that it works means you have to define what works means, and then proving that it'll scale means essentially you have to understand what somebody else is going to define as works at scale. The very story that I think was so moving to me when I read, Howard Florey essentially approached every pharmaceutical from every firm that made any healthcare, drugs. He approached everyone in the UK and everyone in the US, and they all turned him down. And this was essentially a senior faculty member who headed a research lab. And he came out of that saying, I felt like a carpetbag salesman. And then he managed to get the government, the US government, to pick it up. But it was an enormous effort to sell to that next level. So I think we always have to be careful. I'm an engineer, and I'm guilty of this too, of pointing to what we used as a metric for what works, and not understanding what other people, the next level, needs to see as a metric for what works, and knowing who they are and how to solve their uncertainty. So that's, I think it's important to realize that our responsibility is selling up as much as it is anything else.
And I think I also am hearing a theme in this. You haven't all said this yet, but curiosity about that other entity or that other group that you might be trying to work with, knowing that you can't accomplish something as an agency all on your own, having the curiosity to find out what is it that we need to do to work together. And I'm also hearing tenacity about that we can't give up if we're trying to do something different. It's going to be hard, and we keep going with it. Thank you for that. Are there other questions, please? In the back.
Hi, Leslie Broody with the California Air Resources Board. Been a very interesting panel. I had a question for Erica. So this morning at our breakout session, one of the barriers that we thought was a big barrier was lack of capacity at the local level, but you've already talked about. Can you tell me what is the most effective use of state funds to build capacity? And I know Louise talked about $80 million that SGC had invested in that. Can you give some ideas
The
on that?
most effective, that's a tough one. I would say I'd go out on a limb and say planning. We don't get a lot of funding for planning. We did with SB2, with housing recently, but that was a rarity. That's not something we see a lot, and a lot of local agencies do need the capacity to plan so that they can have that framework to move from. And a lot of them don't have it. And so that would be probably a huge, huge benefit to local agencies. And then not just the funding to do and flexibility with that funding, because a lot of times there's very prescriptive funding, and there isn't the opportunity to link up some of the other systems within each agency. So we want to make sure that if we do planning, that those plans all speak to one another and coordinate together. And so it couldn't just be a siloed intent, right? We need to have some connectivity amongst it and flexibility with the funding, and I think planning would be amazing.
Great,
Seems
thank-
particularly important if we are trying to do place-based planning and investment,
Absolutely.
right? Like
Yeah.
the silos within that geography just need to go away.
They do need to
Yeah.
go away, and I think there's a lot of support for that at the local level, but not a lot of capacity to do it.
Okay.
Great
Great,
question.
thanks.
Others? Yes. Oh, wait, we need a microphone for you.
Thank you. You've described innovation as a system, right? As this is how you started with this, and you gave a couple of examples with Edison and penicillin, which are single systems, right? Singular systems by themselves at the end of the day. There are different components, but when we're talking about communities and cities, in many ways they are systems of systems. Okay, so how do you start thinking, is it the same process of thinking? Because I mean, I have a feeling you're making, because you started, there isn't much research on cities or communities. I think you mentioned that.
I didn't say there wasn't much, it just,
But
I wasn't
I
aware of
forgot
as
what you
much as I
said,
should.
right? Anyway, but I mean, how would you approach this? Because, you know,
Sure.
it's different systems working together. How do they all sum up together? It's not 1 + 1 = 2.
Right.
You know, so how do you go around thinking about that?
So I guess this was one of those, you know, when I look back on my life, this is one of those, new chapters, sort of, when I began to realize, well, I have an exercise for my students, which is, Edison invented the light bulb. What does he do with it? You know, does he finally figure out what that socket in the ceiling is for, and screw the light bulb into it? You know, does he look, realize what that switch was for? So I actually have the students go back and recognize all of the elements that make up the electrical system. And inevitably, they catch the technical ones, but then I talk about the regulatory ones, and I talk about the economic ones. And I think, so I guess part of the answer there is I had no idea how complex the electrical system even was at the very beginning in terms of the political nature of getting a system approved to embed inside the New York, to lay cable underground and to wire buildings with the technology that was very, very young still. So I think these are systems of systems. We just don't appreciate them because we don't get as close to them. Penicillin is another. I mean, if you look at healthcare and the role that antibiotics, how deeply embedded it is into so many different systems of healthcare, it's, subsystems. They're all like that. So I think the community ones, so my first answer is I think they're probably just as complicated. It's just, depending on our perspectives, we see the complexity of some that we're close to and not of others that we're distant from. Yeah.
Okay, we've got
Glad
time
you asked.
for,
That's a good-
yeah?
Nope.
We've got time for 2 more questions from the audience. I've got one over here.
Okay, hi everybody. Again, I'm Charlotte Glennie, PhD student in sociology here. So I research community gardens and their struggle to maintain land tenure in cities as economic conditions are changing. So I want to return to the idea briefly about innovation and scaling up and the importance of frameworks in that process. When we talk sustainability, we are talking about the 3 E's or 4 E's very often. And from the work that I do, I know that those things don't always fit together really easily. There's a lot of tension, particularly between economics and equity. And so when we have these creative spirals and somebody comes along with a lot of money to help that creative spiral happen, they usually have a particular interest in it, in why they're doing this, right? So with the war effort in the case of penicillin. I'm just wondering, have you all experienced any contestation in that process of developing a framework or observed that? And can you comment on that a little bit? Thank you.
I would like to nominate Bob to answer this. I think he's had more direct experience certainly than I have in dealing with these interests.
I mean, I'll give you an example close to home on this free sustainable school lunch framework and how it led to some of these. I mentioned our chef Santana Diaz, and when he met this, I run the second largest production kitchen. He has figured out. So you can imagine that a big institution like UC Davis, when they make a big buy, right? What do they look for? They look for the cheapest big buy, right? Strategic sourcing means we buy in quantity so we can lower the cost, et cetera. And some of these factors that we're talking about are really hard to find their way onto that list of criteria for that big buy. Well, Santana figured out, but it was mission driven. He figured out by, he used to work in some really big venues like football and basketball arenas and figured out how to deliver food at scale. But when he started working at UC Davis Health, he totally embraced the health mission of that place and added that dimension to what he was doing. So he figured out that there was this grower of organic asparagus up in the Cape Valley that he wanted to get asparagus from at the right time of year when it was in season. And so he made, I don't know the name of it, but United Foods or whoever the heck it was that the big contract was with, he showed up as a guaranteed buyer and said, United Foods, go get it from them, I'll buy it. Okay, and so he cracked the nut just by having that added dimension and realizing the frame he was working in, which required these big scale institutional contracts, which typically just shut it down. So they are completely at odds with this vision and mission about empowering local farmers, supplying local healthy food, changing climate, the climate positive effects of doing that. And he by working within, it was totally contested, but he figured out a way to leverage the large scale and the small scale and crack it. And that model, I think, is going to drive the rest of this collaboration. And I think it's going to be super replicable. Institutions are big monster buyers. So.
All right. Okay, we are, no more time for questions, but to close us out, I'm going to ask you guys to do something a little bit weird, but to the question of how can government, industry, and academia work together to promote the next generation of sustainable communities, because that's what our panel was about, stoking the conversation that's about to happen at tables. I want to go across and have you each give 2 words to say, what is that? So I had said there's this need for tenacity and curiosity among agencies. So I want each of you run across 2 words. What do you think that has to be? And then we're going to break.
2 seconds each.
Who's first?
Erica, I think you're up.
If we're talking about academia, I'd say data and research. We don't have that at the local agency level. We need it. That's more than 2 words, but data and research.
Okay, I'll do one word, but it's hyphenated. Co-create.
Leadership, courage.
Sound a system view. Or how about, no, hyphenated, siloless.
Siloless. All right, let's give a hand to our panel.